So I've really been employing the term holistic wine. If we think about holistic medicine, if we think about a holistic life, it's really about utilizing what grows around us, what nature gives us to remedy the sickness.
You're listening to the Vint Podcast, bringing you expert interviews, alternative market insights, and exclusive access to the world of wine and spirits investing. Enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast. My name is Brady, and I'm joined once again in studio by Billy Galanko. How was your weekend, Billy?
Lots of travel. I was down in just south of Jacksonville, Florida, St. Augustine.
Nice. Gorgeous town, wonderful people, great food and cocktail scene. Well, seafood, cocktail, these kinds of things. Did you have much wine?
A little bit. First, it's the oldest city in, I guess, the continental U.S.
That's right, yeah.
So, European founding city. But yeah, we had a little bit of wine. We can get into that a little bit later. We went to the local winery, went to the local distillery, but I wouldn't call it a fine wine hub.
Sure.
By any means.
Yeah, like local, more like indigenous type varieties, or varieties at least that have been there for a long time. Maybe in the South, which is, I guess, often not indigenous, but stuff that's been growing there, maybe even wild for a long time, especially in the Southeast.
We certainly had some muscadine. We went at that winery. We had a nice presentation where they were telling us that they made the first wine in the continental U.S. in 1865. That's not true. So I was just like, I looked up when California became a state, just in case they weren't counting that, because they made wine in California a lot longer than Spanish. But California was annexed into the Union in 1850. So by all accounts, they were wrong. But it was still interesting.
Yeah, you should. They're trying to put butts in the seats.
Well, the butts were there. I don't know. I guess wine in the mouth, but yeah.
Our guest today, our interview today, Jahdé Marley, she probably would have a lot to say about that. We do get later in the interview, get into a lot of conversation about indigenous varieties, growers, farmers who are stewarding those varieties, especially in places that we don't often think about, like the Northeast and New England, and then the Deep South as well. So yeah, that's a great conversation that we'll bring to you guys a little bit later on. But Billy, I think you have a story that is about some more well-known wines.
Just a little bit. Yeah, just a little bit more well-known wines. So, everybody knows my partner. She had a big event, I guess, in Las Vegas last week that she helped organize. And at the end of one of the meals, basically are under the minimum they're supposed to spend at this restaurant. It was a very nice restaurant in Las Vegas. So the sommeliers they talked to the restaurant. They're like, okay, we'll give you 3 bottles of wine to make up the difference rather than you guys just paying for nothing. So they ended up giving them a DRC Grand Echezot 2017, a 2009 Latour, and a bottle of Harlan, like the main one, but I don't know what the vintage was. It wasn't on the label, and she couldn't remember. So she and the person who also helped organize it were like, great, and they were going to take them home. And her coworker and them, they were like, all right, let's each pick one. So Mei, luckily, I've told her enough about DRC, so she was like, immediately like, this is the one I want. And the other girl was like, cool, I've heard of Napa. I will take this one. So she took the, 1 second here. I just realized that was open. So she took the Napa, and then moving on from there, they had the Latour left, and I guess they were going to try to figure out what to do with it. And her coworker was like, "Oh,
cut the bottle in half."
Yeah, no. I don't think her coworker really wanted it that much, but she was like, "Oh, the photographer has been really nice, and he's the last one here. Let's just give it to him." So they ended up giving, one of the most, 2009 is one of the most sought after vintages in the past, 20 plus years. Also, that was when a lot of the price wrangling was going up, so it was also one of the more expensive bottles, even to this date, of Latour, and they just gave it to a photographer. By all accounts, he was very grateful, but that was crazy. So, I woke up, she told me this, I was on the East Coast, she's on the West Coast, she texted me, and it's like midnight, and I wake up to just a bunch of texts, and then I'm like, I don't really care, I'm just kind of scrolling through, and then I see the pictures, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then I read below, like, we got these. I was like, oh, they got to drink them. Lucky her. And then I was like, wait, are you bringing these home? And then I immediately called her and was like, oh, this is amazing. So yeah, now we have a 2017 Grenache next to me. I need to wrap it in cellophane and figure out where to store it because I don't think our fridge is quite right for that. But I think she's determined to keep it. She says it needs to age for 10 years. She's telling me.
Nice.
I was like, okay, that's okay. Like, I don't know, exactly 10 years is what she says. So, I mean, it's her bottle, so we'll do whatever she wants with it. But
Nice. Yeah, the Latour, I mean, what is it, like, I'm looking up, like $1,600 plus the restaurant markup was probably almost $4,000, wasn't it?
Yeah, that must have been.
That's a nice photographer tip.
Yeah, I mean, they needed to cover $15,000, so picture a restaurant marking everything up 3x. So that was probably the Chazot was probably, I don't know, around 8 or 9. That was probably around 4, and then she picked the Harlan, which even after markup was probably, like $1,500 or something, but
nice.
maybe 2,000 plus. Yeah, so that was a good surprise, but I think that was a good surprise to me, and then I think both of the things that happened to me last week, both my tasting at the local winery and the DRC, kind of parlay into something that you've been wanting to talk about on the pod for a while, and that might be wine snobbery. Can you give us a little effect on that? Like, what is your beef with it, and are you a wine snob?
Well, I was going to ask you what you thought that term even meant, because I'm just trying to think of other hobbies, collector categories, things like that, where people use this kind of language. I mean, I guess.
I think there's a certain affect that comes along with the term snob, though. There's a pretentiousness that I associate in any category with the word snob.
Right, but I feel like if you Googled, like, if you could do blank snob, the first thing that would come up is wine snob. So why is like wine put in this category of, if you express any kind of like preference about either service, style, or like participate in like thoughtful tasting or these kinds of things, you can be labeled a snob. I often experience this with my family. I'll be like, they'll bring a bottle, like a grocery store wine, maybe something that's fine, but they'll say, "Oh, like, how is it?" I'll be like, "It's good, like, it's okay," or something like uninteresting. And they'll say, "Oh, like, not good enough for you," just like jump right on that. Or we were drinking Sauvignon Blanc the other day out on like the patio, and it was like room temperature, and I said, "Do not drink Sauvignon Blanc at like 70 degrees." And they're like, "Oh, well, like, is it like not good enough for you? Like, what do you need to do?" I was like, "Just put some ice cubes in it." So I feel like that's opposite of snob, just trying to like enhance an experience. But what do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, in that specific context, especially, like, you're not being snobby, you're just trying to tell them how to enjoy it more. I do think you have a good point there, though, because snob is either, like I was saying, a pretentious person, but somehow anybody who tries to tell you anything about wine is snobby. And I think that comes from a range of things. One, I think it's typically how the information is presented to folks. It's almost like you're talking down to them rather than trying to help them. Two, I think it's also, there's a lot of folks that say, like, this is the way it has to be done, making it seem like, if you're not doing it this way, it's wrong. So I think that's two essences to it. Nowadays, when I try anything, I mean, you should always just say interesting instead of fine or bad or anything. And then I just try to pull out like random things about like how the wine might have been made. Like we had it's either at the wedding that I went to or somewhere else. My dad's like, "Oh, here's a Chardonnay. Like, what do you think of this?" And I was like, "Oh, there's definitely some extended lees contact at some point on this." Like, and then they're like, "Oh, I don't know what that means." But I mean, like, clearly it just spent, maybe 5 months in a tank and they stirred the lees a few times. But I mean, there you go. I mean, it's interesting there. But yeah. I mean, I do think you should never tell anybody how to enjoy wine. If they want to drink it however they want to and they like it that way, like if they actually enjoy it, like I guess at the winery, the way the guy tried to show people was like, here's one way of doing it, and then here's it either swirled or cooled down a little bit. Can you tell the difference? When you show them, then they tend to be like, oh, I like it better this way. Rather than being like, don't do that. What do you think?
Well, it's like, I don't see. I half agree. I understand what you're saying, but I also half disagree because it's not okay to drink Coors Light warm. It's just, you just don't drink it warm.
You learned that in college.
Right. But it's like, why is it okay to say, oh, like, don't drink a warm beer, like cool it down. But I'm trying to say that with the Sauvignon Blanc, and it's like, oh, like, this wine's not good enough. This, like, $11 wine isn't good enough for Brady.
Well, you need to get them wine with the labels that change color then, so they know when it's cool.
There you go. Yes, they know. Exactly. Yeah. And I think the other was, so this was all wine that was at my mother-in-law's house that she had been given over the years, mainly like 10 years ago at a birthday. And so one was, what was it? Like not Joseph Phelps, Josh. It was like a Josh cab, but I thought Josh was non-vintage. Maybe it's not. Maybe their cab isn't, but the vintage was like 2011 or something on it. And
nice.
Like there just wasn't any fruit, there just wasn't any fruit on it. The finish was super short. And so we were tasting it, and I was like describing some of those things. And I was really just trying to indicate that, this is a wine that really should have been drank like super early, and like it didn't happen. It was probably kept in, it was in the kitchen, so it was probably undergoing a bunch of crazy stuff. It didn't seem faulty, but it was just no fruit, and even that was met with resistance. So,
how is that?
Need to work on it.
Well, that one. I mean, now that's a different story of like, if you want to enjoy your Sauvignon Blanc warm, more power to you. But if you have a red wine that's meant to be fruity and it's old and it's not fruity and it just tastes like a little bit of tannin and like I don't know, weird water, then you have a valid point there. That's not snobbery. That's like, this doesn't taste good. You wouldn't give me like really old orange juice and be like, here you go, this is like 4-month-old orange juice, how do you like it? Like,
well, it wasn't like I didn't have to like dump it out, but it definitely wasn't tasting the way that they intended it to taste when they bottled it, because just knowing the kind of wine that it is and where it was from and all these kinds of things, like, you just know that it wasn't supposed to taste the way it did.
But like, for me, the people who buy Josh, they wouldn't like that flavor profile either. That whatever it tasted like isn't what you bought it for.
Sure, I guess.
Those people are looking for a fruity. It's not like, remember when I described like that Refosco that I had recently, or the Refosk from Slovenia, and it was like pine needles and like, all these herbaceousness, and basically it was a red wine in color only, but there was very little actual fruit. Like those, that would be weird to someone. So it sounds like this is more like up that way, with maybe without the layers of complexity, but there's no way they were actively like, I really like this shit.
Yeah. I actually like those Josh bottlings, like especially the red wines, a good bit for what they are. And so I was trying to defend. I was like, no, I like Josh. That didn't help. But yeah, I think that there's this culture like widely of, and I've come to this before, maybe could get killed in certain circles, but like, oh, just, do whatever you want, enjoy it however you want, as long as you're drinking it, like whatever, like drink wine out of solo cups and plastic bags and whatever you can. It's like, no, like that's not, in a pinch, like sure, you can do that. You don't need to not drink wine when you're camping because you don't have a stemmed glass. But if you have a choice, like try and enhance the experience as much as possible is kind of my approach.
Yeah, no, make it taste as good as possible. No, I think that makes sense. Yeah, you are the one who's famous for saying there is bad wine that's made, so it's not all good. So.
I think our who said our
Emily Saladino.
Our other interviewer though, or interviewee, who we actually haven't released the episode yet, but we have an upcoming episode where one of our Master of Wine experts actually says there's more bad wine out there than people think. So yeah.
But by bad, it's not faulty. It's just not great wine.
Sure, it's just not good.
Well, speaking of wine, the way it is supposed to be, and that wine you might not just like. We went to this Florida winery. We tasted a number of their wines. I'm not sure where a lot of their fruit was from. First, the video that we watched was for a local. It was a a vineyard in Florida, which is cool. My goal down there was to taste local Florida fruit. But then they're at the end of the video, they're like, "Oh, this is a completely different winery," and I was like, "Okay, I'm not sure why we just watched this, but that's great." We went down and tasted. We had there was like a Petite Syrah, a Cab, some other stuff, and I think that it was just from California in general. So I was waiting and waiting, but luckily we had a few muscadine wines. So one, I can safely say I don't think I like the muscadine grape very much. They had like a rosé and a white. The rosé was pretty dark. I think they tried to call it the Vintner's Red, but you could see through it pretty much. They all had a lot of RS, decent acid though, but they did have that. I don't know if it was foxiness as people call it, but there was this distinct smell and kind of finish that was more than herbaceous. So it wasn't quite exactly up my alley, but the main thing that I had read about that I wanted there was a traditional method sparkling muscadine wine. That sounded really cool. Our tour guide, they showed us, they do actually hand riddle them, which is is neat. So it's a very thorough process. We got one of those bottles. I brought it home and we tasted it with my parents, and it was 11% alcohol, which is standard for champagne. If you go get it like a brut, it's 11, 12 after the secondary fermentation. But this was like the sweetest thing that I've had in a long time. The sweetest sparkling wine I've ever had, which is interesting. I think it would actually have been pretty good because there was like some evidence of Lee's time, and it wasn't bad overall. And I think a little bit of the foxiness or whatever, the muscat character was kind of subdued. But it was just so sweet that we all had like a glass and then kind of tucked it away. Didn't really finish it, but it was really cool. And again, this was 100% Florida fruit, so it was pretty cool. And maybe it'd be neat with some food. But yeah, we went out of our way, kind of as we'll get into now with our interviewee, like Jahdé, to kind of, I wanted something that was farmed on a vineyard, and basically it wasn't that far away. So it's pretty good.
Maybe I'm like confusing the process a little bit, but how does it maintain such a high level of RS, like even through secondary fermentation in the bottle?
It had to be dosage.
Okay, I understand.
Because if you put too much sugar in with the yeast, remember,
it'll just keep going. Right?
Yeah. You'll hear with our upcoming guest Peter Leem, champagne expert. You basically it'll explode. That's one of the things that Dom Perignon, and around his time period, they started learning a little bit better, was the exact ratio. And I think maybe it's probably later than that. It was probably the Widow Clicquot who really helped with the process. But over time, they determined exactly the right ratio to get 5 to 6 atmospheres per bottle. Because before they would be sometimes it wouldn't be that bubbly. Other times all the bottles would explode. Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, yeah, so they're basically just adding a ton of sugar water to it.
Which was a shame, because it is process driven. At some point, if they would have just stopped, I would have liked it, or I would have at least enjoyed it, or finished the bottle. But at the end, they were like, all right. It's like when I went to Hungary once and we got a pizza, and I was like, man, this is a good looking pizza. I was at a bus stop, and we we're about to get onto the bus, and it was a beautiful looking pizza. And then they just covered it in ketchup for some reason. And I was like,
no,
I'm not sure why you're doing this. And then I went to get on the bus, and they wouldn't let me on because they said it was too messy because of all the ketchup. So I had to pound this ketchup pizza. And I was like, this is horrible. But that's how I felt about the wine. I was like, this is actually a pretty cool sparkling wine. And then you just dumped all the sugar into it and then sent it out. And I was like, so.
Know thy audience. Billy is a pizza and a wine snob.
Oh, yeah, snob. Well, it's back to my preference.
All this ketchup. You can't eat ketchup on your pizza like normal people?
Oh, it was covered though. I mean, there was sauce underneath too. I don't really know what was going on.
That's interesting.
But that was also 15 years ago. So who knows? Maybe they've upgraded. So.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned, we have a great conversation with Jahdé on some of these smaller producers, lesser known grape varieties, especially in the U.S. And she's a huge advocate for these grower, farmer, kind of family producers who have maybe had vines on their property or around their family for a long time and just haven't had the resources in their kind of regions to be able to monetize it and make it into, a kind of sustainable farming practice. So it's great to hear from Jahdé. She's a wine and spirits consultant. She's based in New York. she also does a lot of community organization around things like environmental sustainability, agriculture in general around wine and spirits, and really just trying to
social
increase
sustainability.
Yeah, social sustainability as well. Yeah, just trying to increase access to the industry, and especially, like I said, in these regions where maybe there's not as much infrastructure, like in the Southeast and places like that in the U.S. So, yeah, I think pressed us on a lot of topics and educated us in a lot of ways that, we've had many folks on the podcast talk about things like sustainability, but I think we have a unique conversation here.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think this is definitely, she gave us a lot of unique points of view, and I really like her just approach. It's like a total, she had a great term, it's not just sustainable, it's not biodynamic. I can't remember exactly what the term is now, but it's really interesting the way she looks at it. It's holistic. It was like holistic farming and winemaking. Sure. And that approach, I found it really fascinating, and I think it's definitely the kind of the future of how wine needs to go.
Yeah, and we I think we've had this conversation with like Raj Parr a little bit, and Jason Haas, right, at Tablas. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, we've had a number of these types of conversations, and Jahdé definitely adds a lot to it. So here's the interview with Jahdé Marley. Hi, Jahdé. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
It's awesome. We heard so much about you from Emily Saladino. She, was when we asked her who we should have on the pod, you were one of the first names that she brought up, and she was raving about you. I met her in New York. She was raving about you. So, yeah, super glad to have you on.
Cool. I really appreciate Emily. She actually gave me the opportunity to write my first published article, which was really, she's great.
Yeah, you always remember that. I was an aspiring writer at 1.2, and I remember there's like folks who were just like, yeah, like you can publish. I'm like, you're going to let me actually like put something online or put something out there for people. So that's awesome. Why don't you, tell our listeners kind of how you got your start in the industry? You can start wherever you want to in terms of, a timeline, but would love to hear about your background and, where you're at
Absolutely. Today. So my very first, employment opportunities were within the industry. Both my grandmother and my mother were diner waitresses at a point, and did well for themselves off of, working real hard for tips. It was kind of romanticized for me. So as soon as I got my working papers, I found myself a little job in a prep kitchen at like 15. And, the natural kind of evolution is going to be once you're able to waitress, you start waitressing, and then you can get behind a bar. And that was all very glamorous for me. Yeah. But I quick realized that I kind of plateaued very early in my bartending career, mostly because of, gatekeeping, and I didn't have too much of a network. I'm from upstate New York, and I wanted to be in these like swanky cocktail bars, and I could not land a job. So I realized that if I went into wine, I could get certified. And between my, 10 years of experience in the industry at a very young age and these certifications, I could get virtually any job that I wanted. So I went on the certification path and was really blessed and lucky to land a job at an all-Italian wine list restaurant. It was heavily focused on native grapes of Italy, with some domestic wine in there as well. And my employer, my superior, I should say, Percy, he gave me so many opportunities to travel, to study using, the restaurant as kind of financial backing. And I was living and breathing Italian wine for years and years, and just really fell in love with the narrative as it is told by the people. Like there's this line between what is accepted by the communities that are stewarding the land in Italy versus all of the DNA and genetic analysis that goes on with the grapes. And it's fascinating to see this kind of like meeting of academia and folklore. And ultimately folklore always wins out in Italy. And I just love that as far as like stewardship and narrative. And I was in Italy for a seminar. I did the Vint Italy Academy thing. And Ian Dagada shared that the most effective way to keep a people oppressed is to deny them knowledge of what only grows in their backyard. And he said that, and bells just started ringing. And it made me think of my ancestry in the Caribbean and sugarcane and our various foodways and all of the bounty that grows on our island, and how we don't really receive the same care when speaking about our products, when speaking about the regional nuance, as wines of European origin are afforded. And that really kickstarted my career as I'm kind of in it now. Prior to that, I was really interested in food pairing, diasporic foodways, Caribbean foodways, and how to pair that with food. And in that moment, it very much changed to, okay, how do I take the products that have always kind of been in my community without the outside gaze, and bring them to the table with a little bit more validity. So that really spun me out on looking at rum in a different way and advocating for rum in a different way, but also looking in my own current backyard, which is the United States, and questioning our wine industry here. It's shocking to me how many native grape varieties come from the United States, but we are so heavily invested in this one species that comes from across the ocean. I'm very much, I was raised about 15 minutes from the original Woodstock site. Environmentalism, sustainability, and nature has always been integral just to my practice as a human. And when I realized that, the most effective way to farm organically, what we know as organic or sustainably, is actually just to grow what wants to grow there, something that, you don't actually need to farm, but rather steward, that really blew open the doors. So now I'd say my focus is very much on native grapes, hybrid grapes, sustainable farming, as well as honoring the labor, culture, and the hands that have stewarded the land of the U.S. and the global South in general within wine and spirits.
Well, that's so much going on at one time. I don't know where to start with that. I will say I love that idea about things, the native grapes or native anything, just not getting enough respect. I do think it's slightly the pendulum swinging back a little bit more. But to your point, in like Italy, it is funny. Like I think Trebbiano di Suave is just Verdicchio, but like you would never have them like admit that ever. They're like, oh no, this is so different. Can you speak to a little bit about how that, I guess, a growing interest amongst even like younger folks, and we can kind of get into younger folks and wine versus older folks, but I think this interest in story and nuance and variety, and maybe even just like drinking less because people want to hear more and like have more interesting items than fewer greater things, how that is helping them dive into also that sustainability, worrying about like where it comes from and then who's actually making it and like what's going on in that community as
Totally.
well.
I think what happens when you start talking about things that just kind of grow around you, you remove this concept of exclusivity. So for so long, the idea was we're trying to be like the European wine community. We were trying to emulate them. And that's something that is very much a product of prohibition. It wasn't always like that. And so I think with, removing this exclusivity and also lowering the barrier of entry, we're not only seeing more young and diverse wine consumers, but also wine producers. If I can go out back and if I can pick some peaches from my tree, and, the knowledge is out there on how to co-ferment that with some grapes that I could pick from downriver, what's to stop me from making wine? And I think that is just so special. So all of this for me is about access. It's about lowering the barrier to entry, and also acknowledging that like all of this has been here before us and it'll probably be here after us. Like we are just interacting with what is, like we don't always have to beat the land into submission in an attempt to plant what we think is supposed to be there. If it's supposed to be there, it's there. Yeah.
Do you? Oh, go ahead, Brady.
I was just gonna linger on the kind of younger wine drinker there for a little bit, because I know that I've read a few studies that younger generators, so like millennial and younger, are getting into luxury quicker than their parents did. Even though like certainly millennials can be a little bit like financially cautious and more wary because of some of the experiences they saw their parents go through, but ultimately getting into luxury sooner, especially Gen Z. And so I think that probably lends to the legacy end of the wine world. Certainly, like we can imagine that a millennial might start to explore that space, but also a deep appreciation for things like stories and place and community, and sustainability, as you're talking about. And so it seems like it's actually a group of generations really ripe for a full range of exploration in wine, both like, drinking Lafite and appreciating, the storied history of, the legacy producers in France, and also some of the things that we're starting to talk about here today. Feels like, both generations are set up for that.
I have a lot to say here. The first thing is that I think that there are individuals absolutely that gravitate towards the luxury, but I think as a whole, like generationally, we actually see wine consumption on the decline. And I think that it's actually a reflection of people pulling away from the more legacy wine producers and things like this. I'm very interested to see a further breakdown of who is actually going for those more historic houses, because my other piece is that we very much live in a hype beast culture that is driven by social media, that is driven by labels, that is driven by kind of, wanting to emulate what you see the people that you deem successful partaking in. And I think that that's going to be responsible for the folks that are looking to get these more exclusive labels. And the thing with hypebeast culture is they're fads and they don't have staying power. You see lines around the corner for Supreme as soon as it drops, but their whole model is they drop very limited and not very frequently, so they can kind of keep that going. And if we're talking about sustainability, and if we're talking about wanting to see something that can last for generations and generations, that's not the move. I have a very vivid memory. One of my first sales calls, so it'll be late 2017, early 2018. I walked into a shop in Brooklyn, and the buyer was on the phone with the Bordeaux deal. And they were literally asking this buyer why people are not buying Bordeaux anymore. Like, they wanted a full market breakdown. And this guy was like, I don't know what you want me to tell you. People are not interested in $350 bottles. The labels are antiquated and people are looking for something new. So I think there's two sides to that coin,
I think also something that a lot of my friends, I'm always trying to get them to drink more wine and like more interesting wine. I've always been about the more obscure varieties and stuff. And what they were like, when I kind of explain it, the little that they know about luxury, they don't know as much about maybe like Bordeaux, but they're like, oh, there must be like very little bit of this made, kind of like the Supreme model. And you think like Burgundy. So it's really fun. And my friends don't really know the difference between like, say a DRC and some wine that's made in this guy's backyard in Italy, and they're like, what, these both only had like 500 cases made? Like, that's so cool. Like, this wine's amazing. So I think learning that is really contributing to people kind of appreciating these smaller producers more, because they're like, well, this is the same as this high-end wine.
Yeah, I think that we have to be very careful as to why they appreciate. Tokenization does not help anybody, and we're seeing a lot in the natural wine world right now, where it's like, all right, people are drinking more natural wine than ever, but why are you drinking it? Do you actually give a crap about this thing? Do you know a flaw when it's next to an intentional winemaking decision, or are you just doing this because this is what's on trend? And for me, if I'm thinking from a sustainable perspective, which is wanting these farmers to be able to bottle, work, and live with dignity, making sure that their kids are taken care of, but also that this industry is in a space where it can continue going. These are not sustainable models. We have to make sure that there is work being done to really educate people, and that we aren't just leaning on this flashy, limited model. It's working for now, but we'll see.
But to your point, though, it'd be interesting to get your point of view on how the industry can transition, because like the more I've gone into my wine studies, understand the business of wine, every like traditional wine growing region and newer one has like, a lot of them have co-ops. There's a lot more co-ops than anybody knows exists. And it's like, how can we make it so that this guy who is growing his own grapes can potentially bottle it, even if he doesn't want to, like have it under his own name and support more folks doing that? And I haven't found an answer yet.
Oh my goodness, this is great. So in my opinion, we're always admiring and emulating the French within wine, right? The most French thing that you could do when it comes to wine is go outside, check what grows in abundance, and ferment that. In Burgundy, it's Pinot Noir, it's Gamay. Awesome. In the United States, it's not that. So we are never going to be able to reach that level of success if we are trying to grow what goes in their backyard. So in my opinion, we need to ferment and drink local. And in response to the kind of co-oping, which really, lends itself to solidarity economics, I founded a wine summit called ABV, Anything But Vinifera, which really is focused on introducing like-minded people who could pool their resources. Maybe you have a legacy Black farmer down south who grows muscadine, but is not in the middle of New York where the natural wine scene is thriving. So they're not aware of how successful their wine could be in bottle if they produced it in this way, which honestly, communities who have been cut off from various resources, we've been working in this way regeneratively, low intervention. All of this actually comes from lack of capital, right? So it's not far off to say, hey, that thing that you do, just continue to do it, bottle it, put this label on it, and you'll kill it. And that's really the point of ABV and ABV ferments in general, is to just get people into the room and say, hey, let's work. Something that I think we overlook within the United States is that European grapes are subsidized. And that's one of the reasons why they're able to get into our market at a fraction of the cost as compared to domestic wine. There's also a history of organization around labor, vineyard labor, and co-oping. Currently, there is a worker-owned cooperative in Vermont called Calce Wine Co., who's very much operating in the spirit of solidarity, community, emulating ways that the global majority have gone about living and producing forever. And I think that, one of their pillars is really sharing how they've gotten to the space that they're in, sharing the different grant models that are afforded to worker-owned cooperatives as opposed to, sole proprietorships and the like. And the more that we share this information, the more that we create these spaces, not with the aim of gaining capital, but actually centering community first. That's how we get better product. That's how we increase access, but that's also how we appeal to a younger generation that places community as one of our priorities.
That's interesting, because for me, co-op always meant you're losing a little bit of sense of place, in the sense that every, say, 10 people grow their grapes and then they just all throw them in and they make one wine, and it's more of just a cost thing for them. I like the idea of pooling resources and allowing each other to hold each other up and still promote their individual thing, but it's still part of this larger collective. I think that's an interesting concept.
I think that, cooperativity and co-ops in general, as they pertain to wine, especially here, it has a little bit of a negative connotation because we're so familiar with state-run co-ops. And when we talk about the old times in Eastern Europe, we know exactly what's happening and why they say there was a time when wine dropped in quality because of this old way of doing things. We know what they're talking about. And that kind of branches out into northern Italy, southern Italy, the south of France, etc. But you're also looking at scale there. I think a lot of the co-ops that we're seeing kind of spring up in the United States, they're not looking to achieve crazy scale. They're more so looking to pool their resources via cooperativity.
And I wanted to touch a little bit on maybe your definition for this moment in natural wine. You talked about maybe the grower who has got some muscadine, do you know that you can, there's actually this there's a style of wine that you can make here that's extremely in demand in other places. Can you kind of define what we mean when we're talking about natural or low intervention, or some of these terms that we throw around? And not that we want to, I think it's actually healthy maybe to put some guardrails around what we're meaning, so that, like you said, you can't pass off a fault as something intentional and artisanal.
Yeah, I use natural wine as a catch-all term because everybody knows what I'm talking about, but I don't subscribe to the dogma. So I think generally when people speak about natural wine, they are speaking about working the land with no synthetic chemicals or as little as possible. We're also speaking about just like letting the grapes do what they do. We don't correct the juice. We don't add any yeast. It's very much about allowing nature to interact with this fruit and make the final product. And the idea is if you're farming with intention and if you're farming really well, all of the work is done in the vineyard. And by the time the grapes get into a fermenter, whatever style it may be, your work is done. You're just now kind of making sure that raccoons don't get into your fermenter, you know, and that you catch it at the right time. I kind of push back on that a little bit because I think that if any of this is going to matter, we have to have full buy-in. And unfortunately, not everybody is in the position where they're able to work organically immediately. We really do have to heal the land, oftentimes via regenerative practices, which is just basically going to be encouraging the soil to be at optimal health while farming. And in order to do that, sometimes we have to make concessions in the earlier stages. Additionally, if we're talking about, you know, younger winemakers that don't have many resources, we can't ask people to allow their ferments to go sour just because they don't want to correct it. Like, that's not fair either. So I've really been employing the term holistic wine. If we think about holistic medicine, if we think about a holistic life, it's really about utilizing what grows around us, what nature gives us to remedy the sickness. So maybe my first go isn't to grab Robitussin, but I know that if I steep a specific tea, that might help your respiratory system. What I'm not going to do is just let you be there all clogged up and sick. So I'm hoping that, you know, yes, we need some definitions, but I'm hoping that there is an evolution and a little bit more acceptance to encourage more people to participate in this thing.
And I think it's interesting mentioning sort of this idea of regenerative farming and some of these practices to heal the land, because we can certainly see that, you know, if someone went, you know, maybe right to fully natural or organic or, no chemicals at all, no yeast, no added yeast at all, these kinds of things, you might get a product that is, you know, maybe fermentation doesn't start, maybe, it's just unpalatable. And that can actually probably even happen in some places where, you know, certainly fermentation can just not happen, you know, through the natural yeasts that are there in a place that's really healthy. What's sort of the, you know, how do any guardrails that you might place on the natural wine movement, how can we help to allow for something like yeast to be added to like jumpstart some of these processes that could take place naturally and in a different year, maybe?
I think that there's a couple things here. The first is to incorporate more than just grapes. If you bump it up with some apple juice, you will start to ferment.
Sure.
So there's that.
Yeah, right.
The other thing is, you know, if you're adding yeast, it needs to be a remedy, not the recipe. So try, you know, and if you need to bump it up a little bit, that's what you do. But I don't think that should always be the go-to. There was something else that you said there.
Yeah. So not as, because like usually if I would think about, you know, natural wine or low intervention and someone said like, oh, like we added yeast or we did this like other thing that was outside of just letting the grapes be there, I'd be like, oh, is that out of bounds? I don't know. That's why I was asking. Yeah. So I think the idea of the co-ferment, that's interesting.
There's that. There's also ultimate transparency and reasoning. If you can sit down with me and tell me why you had to use IPMs, integrated pest management, and you weren't able to use a strictly organic regimen, and you sat me down, you explained your region to me, you explained the disease pressures, you tell me what grapes you're using, and that just doesn't cut it, and I need to employ these IPMs, that should absolutely be allowed. And actually, that's only better for the full community, because now you have more terroir to explore. You have more people participating in this conversation. And this enables us, as you know, we were saying a couple of minutes ago, to actually look to our backyards and look locally. So when you employ these kinds of things, I'm thinking specifically of Virginia and North Carolina right now, it is essential for these IPMs to be accepted. Same thing in like New Jersey. You know what I mean? Humidity is just crazy. So if we want the diversity that we claim to want, these are the measures that we kind of have to take. And dogma doesn't help anybody, but there needs to be transparency around it, and let us know the whys. You know, I think as an industry, we oftentimes downplay the intelligence of our consumer and our enthusiasts, and you know, they can handle it. It's okay. We can have full conversations. It's totally fine.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And what some people don't think of too in terms of regenerative or organic is like if something was farmed conventionally and then you immediately shift over, like you've killed like the whole biome. So the things that are good are not there as well. So you need to take time to ease some of these elements in to start that like cycle again. So I think,
your land literally goes into withdrawal. And if you're speaking about working class folks that need that vintage to keep going and pay their bills, they can't afford grapes that are in withdrawal. They don't get a product from that. Derek Trowbridge, Old World Winery, he's one of my absolute heroes in this industry because recognizing that he puts a lot of energy into this mulch generation that is mycelium rich. And rather than just like keep it on site, he actually bags it. And he works with the local junior college to like get it in the hands of farmers, hard stop farmers, with the understanding that you're going to reach more people by working with the junior college as opposed to like a UC Davis, and understanding that all of this takes time to generate. He has the time. Here you go. This is an easy application. And then through that, you know, you're helping people to heal their land so you can eventually have this organic conversation. But that's not where you start, by telling somebody that they're doing things wrong with no kind of remedy or assistance in, you know, helping them to work in other ways.
Yeah. Let's take like, I guess, a step back and sideways. Vinifera, can you give everybody a little bit of explanation on like what that is if they're not as familiar? And then I'd love to talk about more outside of just like the other species of grapes, what you're promoting, I guess, in terms of like co-ferments, because I've been raving about them for years now with Brady, so would love to dive into that.
Amazing, yeah. So every single grape that most people associate with wine, from your deep cut native Sicilian grape variety to your Cabernet, Spain, Portugal, Georgia, and throughout, they're all one species of grape. They are all mutated from this one mother vine, and that is Vitis vinifera. In the United States, we have a number of grape species. We have Labrusca, Riparia, Californica, all of the muscadines. And when you have more diversity, if you think of biodiversity, you tend to have more health. So that's the big conversation with like Vitis vinifera coming from the EU versus all of these other grapes. And it's not just the US. South Asia has native vines as well. There's some really cool hybrid wines coming out of Japan right now. It's just so fascinating. And then with co-ferments, it's like, one, you could bump up sugar and really encourage the production of alcohol if something is stuck. Big fan of that. But also, it's not just apple grape co-ferments. You have various communities that brought their fruit ferment culture over with them. Yeah. So you have all kinds of peach wine. You have all kinds of strawberry wine. I think about, you know, the mango wine and the cashew wine that you encounter down in the Caribbean. Like these all are wine to the local folks that consume them, just because they're not made from what, you know, a couple of people have deemed noble grape varieties does not make them inferior. Yeah, they're still delicious, and some have great complexity. When we go into hybrid grapes, going to reference Plebe specifically here in North Carolina. Those wines, he holds them back for 3-4 years. Lee stirring, Solera, it's fascinating. And he also co-ferments some shag bark that he takes off from his land in a way that, you know, it's commonly integrated for flavor within high Appalachia. And he's putting that into one of his wines and just really giving a full snapshot of a given region and the terroir. And the more you're kind of employing, I even think of like Retsina in Greece, you know what I mean? Like them incorporating that pine and how it's been now so closely associated with the region. Like we have all that too. And I think it's a really cool way to bring a narrative into the conversation that isn't so steeped in Eurocentricity.
Yeah, no, I think that's what's also kind of funny about that is that our local varieties actually did almost kill Vitis vinifera in the first place, like when it went back to Europe, which is kind of funny. Just because, to your point, they were stronger because of their biodiversity, probably.
Two things. Vitis vinifera, or I should say,
Phylloxera.
Thank you. The phylloxera got over to the EU on cargo ships during the time of slavery. So if we really sit there and think about that, there's a little bit of karmic justice that is associated with that. Also, the American grapevines, the rootstock is what saved that industry. And that kind of goes into this philosophy of being holistic, which is that if there is an ailment, if there is an illness in nature, the remedy is growing somewhere around it, because that is what encourages life and evolution. So this hybrid conversation, it's not new. There's been an interdependence between the US and the EU by way of grapevines for generations at this point. Because of prohibition, our contributions were forgotten and or erased in many situations. And I think we're just now seeing a kind of return back to an old cultural heritage thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's the spot on. And it's like, but to your point though, they built this like defense, and then people started like, oh, we can save ourselves from phylloxera. And then they're like, oh, it turns out these vines have also like developed like a drought resistance and this and that. And now like most people don't know, but most of Europe is now on hybrid American rootstock. It's not even just like plain American rootstock. So it's exactly what you're talking about.
And it's encouraging, evolution. Like there's this misconception that all hybrids kind of start in a petri dish in like labs. And it's like, no, there were serious breeders who dedicated their life and all of their senses into identifying vines and rootstock that would ensure that the species could thrive and live on. And that was really important work that I don't think should be confined to a petri dish or cheapened or robbed of its culture and the people who really dedicated their time and energy to that,
Are there, I kind of want to try and highlight some of the folks, you've already dropped a few names, I think, of folks who are doing have some of these projects and are doing it really well. Is it right that you spent most of your time coming up in the industry around New York here domestically, or have you spent more times in other regions here in the US around wine? And who do you know in those places who are, doing some of the things that you're talking about?
Cool. I am a lifelong New Yorker. Most of my experience is here. That said, most of my wine experience, as far as like vineyards and things like this, pre me establishing my book, was spent over in Italy. I spent a lot of time over there. That being said, since I've joined Zev Vine Selections, I manage his domestic portfolio as well as utilize his logistics and his resources to kind of have my own small portfolio comprised of often overlooked regions, grape varieties, and communities. That's where I currently spend most of my time, is with those producers. So that's going to include Plebe, who I've already mentioned, down in North Carolina, Calce, who we dropped up in Vermont, working with hybrid grapes and fruit and herbs, forage botanicals, just awesome project. Comuna, working out of Philadelphia, but is kind of ignoring state lines and looking more at proximity. So they're working with fruit from Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey. I have RAS, which is a blueberry winery up in Maine. Blueberries have been growing in the United States for over 10,000 years before humans were here. So if you talk about something that just wants to grow somewhere, blueberries really like American soil, I'm working with Ashanta out in Sonoma. They do a lot of wild foraging. I actually asked someone if they knew them a couple weeks ago. They're like, oh yeah, those weirdos that like forage for stuff on the side of the highway. I'm like, yeah, they're my favorite people. That's them. North American Press, Matt Neese, who is actually doing a lot of breeding on his own and doing some really hard work of convincing established vineyards to plant these vines to see how they respond in different climates, different exposure, and really setting the stage for the development of heat and drought resistant hybrids out west, because it is just a catastrophe out there. And we also have American Wine Project, who's working in the Midwest. And the beauty of what Erin is doing, and this goes back to the conversation we're having about just like how to approach a farmer when you want to bring them into this low input conversation. The Midwest was like the hotbed for American wine pre-prohibition. And you have a lot of legacy native grape and hybrid farmers out there who have kind of been left to fend for themselves and forgotten. So they are not, receiving the same consult on how to prune their vines, how to train their canopy, which ultimately would enable them to farm with lesser inputs. So Erin's working with them. She's buying the fruit, she's forming community, and she's doing the hard work of just kind of inching them into this conversation. It's so important and so inspiring. There's Wild Ark Farm, who's not in my book, but Todd up in New York State. Those were some of the first hybrid wines that I actually ever sold. I sold his first vintage when I was working at L'Amico at the Italian Wine List. He's doing amazing, amazing work. There's Chris Renfro from the 280 Project. He's working out of Alamany Farms, which is like a community garden that he is encouraging the local youth to work and get back to land via grape growing in this garden, and also runs a Feed the People collective. What we do with land in addition to growing grapes. So like, what about your cover crops? What about your interplantings? How are you utilizing this to interact with the community outside of just fermenting? Because ultimately fermenting is supposed to be the second step. The first step, you're supposed to use this fruit, this food to feed people. Just such inspiring work going on within this community.
Can you talk a little bit more about sustainability, like the human side of things? And I'm sure you've read about them, but as for some of my WSET stuff, I had to write a paper on sustainability, and like I didn't realize Chile has actually, like, I knew they were doing sustainable viticulture, but there's like actual like almost whole towns and villages down there that like part of their mission is like to build schools or to make sure like the people working in the vineyards have enough to like education afterward if they want to, or be able to support their kids. Like I didn't really think about that as like an all-encompassing part of what actual is on that label that means sustainability in wine.
Interesting enough, I realized very early on in my career that a farmer could increase their profits once their crop was fermented. And that went hand in hand with the realization that a lot of folks who work the land ultimately cannot afford what it is that they're growing, whether it be wine, food, or otherwise. And I think that's really at the root of sustainability, right? Which is, what are the hands that are interacting with this product? The chemicals that are being used, are they harmful to the earth? Are they harmful to the human? Can laborers afford housing in the communities that they're actually working within? All of this goes into this idea of sustainability. And we seem to understand that when it comes to like a biome, a biosphere, we seem to understand that ecologically, but when we incorporate the economy and when we incorporate, the human person, that same concept of like a closed circuit seems to fall out. And within this, and this is what I say about biodynamics, but I really apply it to sustainability, we need to make sure that what we are taking out, we put back in. And that just doesn't apply to vegetables being pulled out of the garden, but we also have to think about the energy that we're expending and our life force. Ultimately, this is time that we're taking away from spending with our kids. This is time that we are not at home, that we are putting into this product. How does this product now feed us? And it's not just within, a single plot, but when we look at Napa land prices are out of control. It's like that because the land is valued as such because the wines carry a certain price tag. So to bring it back to Chile, I think that the want there is, hey, if this wine now has a certain price tag, and if people from France are going to want to come in and now they want to start vineyards and they want to start bottling this, how is this going to affect us as the community around this land that has been stewarding it for however long? And not only affect, but how is it going to benefit us? And for me, that's social sustainability.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's spot on. I I never thought of it, the idea of like a biosphere, how we all understand, and then the energy you're putting in, actually getting that back. That's really interesting.
Yeah. Whether you subscribe to it or not, I mean, that's your business. But I find it fascinating that people can understand all of this, like what some would deem wonky biodynamics. But then when it comes to like the human organism, that same energy flow tends to stop. And I don't really subscribe to exclusivity or individualism in that way. I think that it's all a giant net. And it's one of the reasons why I'm drawn to wine, is because it's so easy to kind of point to the centers in the web within the grape growing and fermentation process.
It probably was easier for Steiner to think about that when he's in France. I mean, he wasn't just talking about wine. I don't think people know that his like writing expands everything or covers everything. But when somebody's in it,
eugenics. I mean, Steiner was a noted and out Nazi.
Yeah, he was absolutely insane. But I will say the idea of biodynamics, though, catching on in like France it's much easier to explain to someone who has had this property given to them and it's been passed down for generations and they're not paying. Well, I guess you pay death taxes, but still, it's different than somebody trying to, start biodynamics on their own property and they're not able to really. It's just a much different business proposition trying to explain to somebody, telling somebody else in a different place why they should do it. And why it should work economically, and not understanding why.
I think there's also something to be said for wanting to like emulate a foreign process onto your own land. So like biodynamics are going to vary greatly depending on what region you are in, because you're going to be pulling from different animals, different vegetation sources, and the like. I also think it's really important to acknowledge that like native people of any given land have been working in this way forever. All it really is making sure that there is a full circle going on, that your waterways are not being polluted by what you do to the land and vice versa, so your fish can thrive, so your wild animals don't die out, so the vegetation can thrive. Like, these are all very basic tenets. And it's important, at least for me in my work, that just because something isn't documented, that we don't write it off. A lot of our history is oral history in cultures and in people that aren't of European origin. So I think that if we can sometimes just close the book and look at something with practicality, oftentimes we're able to gain a lot of insight. And the native peoples of the United States, they're still around. Despite the greatest efforts, they are alive and they are resources, and you can see people still working in this way and it being passed down. And it's just really a joy to witness. And part of the work that I'm part of and that I really hope continues is just the preservation of these practices and crediting, the people that have been doing it for making this work accessible.
Yeah. On that note, can you maybe talk about the distillation stuff, some of the stuff we were talking about online and some of those traditions and things that have been passed down that nobody talks about?
Absolutely. I actually wanted to bring this up before. When we were talking about fermentations going awry, one of the ways that we can actually make sure that our projects are profitable when kind of experimenting with this natural wine route is if something goes awry, if VA takes off, if it gets all mousy, if it's just not what you want in bottle, you can put it through a still and make something beautiful. And you see a lot of that going on in the EU. Unfortunately, we're not able to do it as often. It is something that traditionally was done because it's illegal, both in the United States and the EU, to have your still and your winery within the same facility. So unless you have incredible means, you're not able to have both. And oftentimes there's even land restrictions. And that's kind of more exclusive to like European invention. But I think a really important part of the conversation of levers and outlets to allow people to experiment without going broke. Additionally, I think a lot of these practices kind of draw on more ancestral applications. Being in the United States, the mezcal boom is real. And there's so much exploration via Filipino stills, what that means, how did they get here, why are they called that, why is a tree trunk responsible for this distillation. You see very similar kind of applications in West Africa with the distillation of palm wine. You have, Fini and other kind of ancestral distillates going on in South Asia made from cashew fruit and otherwise. And there's just seems to be a lot of soul in these products. And I think the reason for that is because the stills themselves are made from products that are easily accessible and kind of grow around you rather than these hyper industrialized stills. When you think about copper and stainless and column, all of this is really there for the most part for efficiency. When you take that efficiency and when you take that scale and when you take the commercialization out of it, you tend to get a more soulful product. And that's what we see with mezcal production. That's what we see with the rum production that really seems to catch people with these like incredible esteric profiles or, very site-specific sugarcane bottlings. It all kind of comes from this time where resources weren't as plentiful, where things weren't necessarily made to be mass-produced commodities. And that, for most enthusiasts that have like a refined palate, seems to stick out. And that's where this whole fetishization, hypebeast culture can kind of creep its way in, is like, in order to make things in this way, it has to be by the 500 bottle. You don't get these things made by 500,000 liters,
That makes, so I had two quick questions on that, and then I'll let Brady hop in. One, I've always been told that like copper needs to be involved somehow to take sulfur out, so that's more of a process thing. The other thing is, my mind is blown now. I'm thinking about like single plot sugarcane rums. Are these like rum agricoles, or are they like the traditional dark rums that we've seen? Like what are they like?
So rum agricole has to be from Martinique. So they're not all rum agricoles, but Martinique and Associated Islands, it's a French AOC. But this pressed cane application for rum is where you tend to get the most overt terroir expression. Haiti specifically is where a lot of people find this, but it's easy to understand if you understand history and socioeconomics. Haiti since 1804 has been absolutely cut off from the developing world. So they are very much in a time of lesser technological advancement. And that results in these more soulful spirits. They're working using clay, but you find it elsewhere. You find it throughout, sugarcane producing countries where they are using pressed juice. It's really, really cool. There's also some terroir in molasses. I don't want to discount that, but I think it's more apparent in these fresh cane distillates.
Nice. I always love them, and I will now call them fresh cane distillates.
Cool. And awesome. Copper is most oftentimes associated. Sometimes it could be just a little piece. But, again, we're not being too dogmatic. If something, is there and can ensure safety, then it should be incorporated. But the main body of these stills that we see are made of mud, concrete, tree trunks. They're huge. They're wood fired. It's so cool. Or, it's still copper. It's still metal, but you can tell just by the shape that it's been formed by hands and by mallets and not by machine. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we could probably do another 45 minutes on spirits. So we'll have to do a part two. It's been awesome hearing, especially your perspective on sustainability. We've done here and there on sustainability on the podcast with other guests, and then between just Billy and I. But to hear you go as deep and as broadly, both depth and width as you did was really awesome. Both domestically and being able to talk, outside here of the U.S. was great. So we really appreciate your perspectives there, and we want to welcome you back to be able to talk about spirits at some point. And I'm sure there's much more depth in that conversation that we could explore too.
There's a lot. And I also just want to say, this wine and spirits thing, it really is just a vehicle for connection. And as much as, it also can be used for some escapism, and we are absolutely all entitled and deserving to a break and to escape. That is not to say that's all that it can be. And I really choose to use this vehicle that I've been so lucky and blessed to really be a part of and integrated into, to speak about other issues that I think are pressing and that I think affect all of us, and ultimately true sustainability, which is getting ourselves to a point where we continue to do things the way that we are doing them for the next 100, 200 years without too much struggle.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, like we were talking about offline a little bit, there are certainly places and peoples who have figured it out in terms of making sure that their land, their people, and like their foodways survive past the next generation. And I feel like a lot of times conversation is even just like, well, like my kids X, or but thinking generationally down the line, that's a whole different framework. And so I appreciate you bringing that to us.
Absolutely.
Billy, do you have anything else?
As you said, a lot of questions. We could go on for hours, but I think for now, I'm good.
Thank you, guys.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jahdé. Really appreciate it. We'll talk to you again soon.
Appreciate it. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
All right, that was our interview with Jahdé Marley. I hope everybody learned a little bit more about holistic winemaking and viticulture, and is keeping all aspects of sustainability in mind when they're looking at their wine, including the social aspects. And yes, that's our episode for this week, and we'll be back with another great interview next week. Cheers.
To check out our current offerings and to sign up for the Vint platform, find us at www.vint.co. That's www.vint.co. For questions, comments, or feedback on the Vint podcast, please email us at support@vint.co. Vint and VV Markets are offering securities pursuant to Regulation A. Our offering circular as amended can be found on the SEC website. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments such as those on the Vint platform are speculative and involve substantial risks to consider before investing. We may provide communication that may contain certain forward-looking statements that are subject to various risks and uncertainties. Information provided in any communications, including this podcast, is not legal, business, or tax advice. All prospective investors should consult a legal, tax, or business advisor concerning the subject matter of any communications and any offering.